Welcome, I'm Stella Gryllia and I'm presenting joint work with Amalia Arvaniti and Baltazani. I'll be talking about the contribution of pitch accents and boundary tones to intonation meaning. The research presented here resulted from the project Components of Intonation and the Structure of Intonational Meaning, funded by the British Academy. Let's start. In the existing literature on intonational meaning, a recurring question is whether intonational meaning is compositional or whether we should treat it as a gestalt. Some accounts argue that intonational meaning is compositional and each element of the tune is a morpheme. Pitch accents and boundary tones contribute equally to the overall meaning of the tune, which is interpreted in context. Opponents of this view argue that intonational meaning arises from sequences of tones grouped into morphemes contributing as a whole to interpretation. Tunes are considered idioms or abstractions. So given this debate in the literature, I would like to show you our research questions. So the first one is there experimental evidence for meaning compositionality? And if there is, do pitch accents and boundary tones contribute equally to the overall meaning of the tune? To address these questions, we ran a series of perception experiments on Greek WH questions. Let me now give you a bit of background on Greek WH. We know from earlier work by Arvaniti and Baltazani in 2005 that WH questions in Greek are typically uttered with one of two tunes. So in one you see the rising tune. It's a tune that ends with a rise and we'll be using the term rising to refer to it. While in two you can have a tune that ends flat and we will be using the term flat tune to refer to it. Both tunes are nuclear and they differ in pitch accent. So in the rising tune you see that we have a low star plus high, and this is a late peak. While in the flat tune we have a low plus high star, and this is an early peak. The two also differ with respect to the boundary tone. So in the rising tune we have a high boundary, while in the flat tune we have a low boundary. And interpretation. So questions with the rising tune are mainly interpreted as information seeking, while the ones with the flat tune are more complex and they can be interpreted as information seeking or as carrying implicatures of a negative type. So if I ask a question like, why should I hire Paulina, and I use a flat tune, I can mean that I'm doubting Paulina's credentials in getting the job. And we've experimentally shown this in a paper by Baltazani, Gryllia and Arvaniti in 2019. Let me now show you the two tunes and apply them to you.
Πόση ώρα έχουμε ακόμα?
Πότε θα είναι έτοιμο το παντελόνι?
You see the rising tune and I will try to play it for you.
Πόση ώρα έχουμε ακόμα?
Well, on the lower panel you see the flat tune and I'll play it again for you.
Πότε θα είναι έτοιμο το παντελόνι?
Yeah, so these are the two tunes. The one ends with a rise, the rising tune, and the other one ends flat and we have a low boundary tone. They differ with respect to interpretation, as I told you, and also with respect to pitch accent. So what we did, and I'll show you now what we did. So we ran 3 experiments using the betting paradigm, and here we are presenting 2 of them. In the first one, the boundary tone was masked, while in the second one, the pitch accent was masked. Let me now show you our hypothesis. We hypothesized for experiment 1 that stimuli with a late peak should lead to higher bets for information-seeking follow-ups than stimuli with an early peak. In experiment 2, we hypothesized that rising stimuli should lead to higher bets for information-seeking follow-ups than flat stimuli. For both experiments, we expect controls to lead to strongest bets followed by bets on match, and for mismatched stimuli, we expect that beds should be around 50 years. Let me now show you the task. The task shows our participants here WH questions and they show two possible follow-ups, and we ask them to bet using 0 to 100 euros on the most likely follow-up. So they would listen to a question like, when will the train for Kalevala leave? And they would see two possible follow-ups, one indicating that they interpreted the WH question like information seeking. It will look something like, do you happen to know? And the other one would be an indication of non-information seeking interpretation, and it would be, we have been waiting for hours. We also show you on the slide what our participants actually saw. Let me now tell you a bit about the stimuli that we used. About the stimuli, we had 32 controls that were elicited from 8 speakers of Standard Greek, 4 female and 4 male, using a discourse completion task. Each of them contributed 2 rising tunes and 2 flat tunes. We used this stimuli as a basis to create our synthesized stimuli, and we manipulated the stimuli in 2 ways. So either to create an early peak, and with early peak we mean that the peak was set at the middle of WH word stress vowel, or creating a late peak, and with late peak we mean that it was set 20 milliseconds into the post-accentual vowel. In this way we created matches and mismatches. So a match is a base that had an early peak and it was manipulated towards an early peak. That's an instance of match. Or we also generated mismatches. So again, a base with an early peak that was manipulated in a stimulus with a light peak. That's an instance of mismatch. Once we were done with the F0 manipulation, we applied high-pass filtering. So the second half of each stimulus was high-pass filtered at 5 kHz with 12 decibel attenuation using Audacity. Then our stimuli were split into 2 versions of the experiment. So we had 16 controls and the 2 stimuli derived from each one of them. Let me now tell you a bit about our participants. So 66 participants were recruited via social media and Prolific, and 34 participants did version 1, while 32 participants did version 2. And now it's time to look at the results. Let's look now at our results. So what we see is that late peak led to higher bets for information seeking follow-ups than early peak, and this holds for both controls and matches. In the case of mismatches, Pete's accent did not differentiate the bets. In both cases, they end up around 50 euros. Now, if we look on the left panel where we have the early peak cases, what we see is that there was no difference between controls and matches, and both of them led to significantly lower bets than mismatches. Now let's move to the right panel where we see the late peak, and there the situation is a bit different. So controls led to significantly higher bets for information seeking than both matches and mismatches. What you also see is that matches led to significantly higher bets than mismatches. Yeah, so these are the results, and they're as we expected them to be. Let's now move to the discussion. So what we saw is that Pete's accent alone can change the betting behavior of participants. So this is an argument saying that the pragmatics of the questions is strongly influenced by the type of Pete's accent used. And we also have an indication that the base plays a part in how the questions are interpreted. We also saw a difference between early and late pitch accent with respect to controls and matches. So for the case of early pitch accent, controls and matches yielded the same results. But in the case of late pitch accent, this was not the case. And a possible reason could be that in the case of late peak, that it's related to our manipulation, that it was not placed as late as it could be. And this is a point that requires further investigation. Let's move now to experiment 2. In experiment 2, as I told you, we masked the pitch accent. So experiment 2 has the same stimuli and the same procedure as before. And the only difference is that the high-pass filtering left clearly audible the boundary tone now. And we started again with 32 base sentences, and we manipulated them with respect to the boundary tone. So we either had the tune ending flat with a low boundary tone, or the tune ending with a rising tune in a high boundary tone. And in the case of the high boundary tone, we set it at the middle of question range. With the same logic as in experiment 1, we have matches. So a base with a low boundary tone that was manipulated to still have a low boundary tone is an instance of match, while an original low boundary that was manipulated in order to become a rising, a high boundary tone is an instance of mismatch. For experiment 2, we had 88 participants that were recruited via social media again in Prolific, and 41 of them did version 1, while 47 of them did version 2. Let me now show you the results. Let's now look at the results. What we see is that rising tunes, so high boundary tones, led to higher bets for information-seeking follow-ups than low boundary tones. And this applies to controls. It also holds for matches and applies for mismatches. Now, if we look what happens within the low boundary tone, what we see is that controls led to significantly lower bets than matches and mismatches, and we also see that matches led to significantly lower bets than mismatches. Now, if we look at the right panel where we have the high boundary tone, we see no difference between controls and matches. And both controls and matches led to significantly higher bets than mismatches. And although we see that low boundary tone mismatches led to higher bets than low boundary controls and matches, and that high boundary tones mismatches led to lower bets than high boundary tones controls and matches, the two sets of mismatches remain distinct. And that's about the results of experiment 2. Let's now move to the discussion. So what we can see is that bets on information-seeking follow-ups were much lower for flat than rising stimuli. What we also saw was that controls showed the strongest bets, and matches yielded overall similar results to controls. Mismatches led to weaker bets, though, as I told you, they still differentiated between low boundary tones and high boundary tones. Let's see now what we can conclude if we put experiment 1 and experiment 2 together. We think and we argue that we have evidence for compositionality of meaning. So pitch accents and boundary tones make independent contributions to meaning. Bets change both in response to the pitch accent and the boundary tone in the absence of the other. And we can also, if we haven't convinced you yet for this, we can also do it the other way around, meaning that if tunes were configurations, then participants should be more severely affected by the absence of tonal elements in the stimuli. So you remember that in experiment 1, we masked the boundary tone, and in experiment 2 we masked the pitch accent. So that's one. And the second one is that bad differences between controls and stimuli should have also been more dramatic, and this is not the case. So the fact that the responses to controls were stronger than responses to stimuli indicates that participants did not simply match the tune fragment they heard to one of the two tunes. So we're grateful to Nikos Vergis and Georg Loving for technical assistance. We would like also to thank Yoros Mikros, Dimitris Papazachariou and Arhodo Terzi for asking their students to take part in the experiment, and of course the British Academy for the financial support. Thank you.